Hey, it's Michelle. Before we jump into this week's episode, I want to recommend a podcast that I have been loving lately. It's called The Run-Up, and it's hosted by New York Times political reporter Estelle Herndon. They're just finishing up their latest season. It's all about people shaping the American political landscape ahead of the 2024 election, outside of public view, before voters are really paying attention. In this week's episode, the last of the season, they go to Iowa, where the Republican primary is heating up, and where evangelical Christians are aiming to play an outsized role again this year. So that's The Run-Up. Find them wherever you listen to us. Subscribe, enjoy. Okay, on to today's show. Lydia, how was your trip?
It was, it was an incredibly illuminating and heartbreaking trip. Going to a place like the border between Chad and Sudan is a pretty intense bit of travel. And it's a thing that I used to do a lot of. And still, I apparently dip a toe into that kind of reporting every once in a while again. And
but you were far enough away that you were not personally in danger. Yes, please.
I was not. You and my mom both very concerned about this.
I got a letter from a listener because I said, Lydia's not with us. She'll be back next week. And apparently this was that was really rude just to mention Lydia and not explain who she was and where, someone was very upset that I didn't explain Lydia.
What would be funny is if Lydia was never on the show, but every week we were Lydia's away.
Lydia's like Bob Sacamano.
If there were if there were no
Lydia.
Lydia.
So that's our new thing. We should make up a fifth co-host.
That's right. Eris won't be with us this week.
Where in the world is Eris? From New York Times Opinion, I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Lydia Polgreen.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm Carlos Lozada.
And this is Matter of Opinion. So my friends, today we're going global. We're talking about America's changing role in the world and whether we may have lost our position as a global superpower. It's a controversial idea, I know. But Lydia, you've been thinking about this a lot of late. Do you want to lay it out for us?
Well, so I wanted to talk about foreign policy today because India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in D.C. this week. And there have been a lot of things that have happened in India over the last few years. We're seeing atrocities against Muslims. We're seeing the space for free speech and for civil society shrink. The country is definitely becoming more autocratic than it was when I lived there in the late 2000s. But you're not going to hear a peep about any of that from the Biden administration. India is a crucial ally of the United States on a number of issues. Most specifically, it's a really important counterweight to China. So this is why I wanted to talk today. Earlier this year, President Biden hosted a summit of democracies at which he declared that democracies were getting stronger and autocracies were weakening. But at the same time, some of our key allies, Israel, India, are becoming more autocratic. We have other friends like Saudi Arabia that are out and out autocratic. So what organizing principles guide our foreign policy now? And is all this talk about democracy just talk?
I think part of the challenge for the U.S. right now is we have a tendency to want to sort of look for simple binaries and say, okay, well, these countries are becoming more autocratic and we are remaining more democratic. And so now the world is divided between democracy and autocracy, right? So Modi's India is a good example. Modi is not a liberal, as sort of American liberals certainly would understand the term. And Indian politics has become more sort of religiously intolerant, I would think it's fair to say, in the last 10 or 15 years. At the same time, there's no question that Modi is an extremely popular, democratically elected leader. He's not running a, autocracy in the style of the czars of Russia or, Joseph Stalin or anything like that, right?
Or even Vladimir Putin.
So you have a set of countries that are actually dictatorships, and then you have a range of countries, Turkey, India, Brazil in certain ways falls into this category, where democracy isn't about to disappear, but the nature of that democracy is just changing in ways that are different from what I think people saw in the 1990s and what people were expecting.
So let me jump in with a question for any of you, which is that to what degree do you think that global fatigue with America trying to push this binary has become a real problem? Like, you're either with us or against us, which is a very American sort of thing.
I mean, part of it is that binaries are easy, right? And they're comfortable and they're familiar, right? The Cold War, capitalism v. communism, Rocky v. Von Drago, right? It's something that you can all kind of like rally around. And that's why autocracy versus democracy is kind of the seductive way to frame it now for the Biden administration. Except it's not that it sort of recently has stopped selling. It hasn't been selling well for a while. There's Putin gave this like famous speech in 2007 where he basically said, you guys are hypocrites. You're lecturing us about democracy, but you don't want to learn it yourself. So this predates Trump. This has been going on. That disenchantment with American power, with American hegemony has been present for a while. Now it feels like it's kind of coming to a head, in part because Biden has a hard time making the pitch. When he says, America's back, we're re-engaging, rebuilding alliances, taking on authoritarianism. Yet when he talks about America itself, not to the world, but to Americans, it's all about like, we're on the brink. We have to save our own democracy. And so it just gets to be a harder pitch to make about American leadership.
I think that's right. And I think, you see that really clearly with India. There, I think, has just been this absolute reluctance to criticize India in any way. I think that just sort of adds fuel to the fire of this conversation about hypocrisy. It's something that I heard a lot about on my trip to Chad, actually, sitting around talking to aid workers from around the world and Chadian journalists. And, they kind of roll their eyes and say, oh, yeah, America cares about democracy. Yeah, right.
Well, there's also two different accusations of hypocrisy, right? I mean, I feel like the people who you're talking to, Lydia, who are sort of people deeply committed to a vision of human rights, who are sort of activists, aid workers, and so on, their view would be it's hypocritical for the U.S. not to criticize Modi or the Saudis or any of our allies for human rights violations, right? From the point of view of Modi's government, though, or the Saudis, right, to say nothing of Putin or Beijing, it's hypocritical for the U.S. to criticize them when we have also done bad things ourselves. So these are sort of two different kinds of accusations.
Hasn't this always been kind of an awkward, hasn't America always kind of made awkward alliances, though, whether you're talking about the Middle East or Latin American regimes over the years in the name of kind of broader geopolitics?
Yeah. During the Cold War, that's what the Soviets said all the time. Like, you lecture us on freedom, but look how you treat Black Americans. And in fact, there was very much a kind of Cold War impulse behind some of the major civil rights reforms of the 60s, where it was not just because, the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act are the right thing, but like these are battlegrounds in the global chessboard against communism. And we have to show that we're not hypocrites.
I think that what has changed is the kind of total war and total struggle between an ideology like communism, right, and what the United States represented. I think that contrast was easier to justify, perhaps, a whole range of terrible hypocrisies, because at the end of the day, you were fighting against a totalitarian regime that would destroy all freedom, and all can be forgiven in order to avoid that fate, because everything else would be lesser than that. And, I don't share that point of view, but I think that was, a guiding light of much of American foreign policy for that period. And I think right now we don't have that, right? I mean, this sort of mushy idea of, let's support democracy and freedom, but let's not get too into the weeds about what that means so that we can keep in the club of democracies, the countries that we like and need things from. It adds and really sharpens the hypocrisy question.
But this is part of, I think, the appeal of a certain kind of extremely ideological framing of the Ukraine war to a lot of voices in U.S. foreign policy, right? The idea being that this is the Cold War again. This is the ideological challenge of our times. I'm very skeptical of this narrative, in part because as a young conservative, I embraced a different version of it after 9/11, right? This was the neoconservative and to some extent centrist liberal narrative after 9/11, that here in Islamic fundamentalism, we had the great ideological enemy, and we could organize our entire foreign policy around it. And that went very badly. And so I sort of am constantly hesitant over that kind of framing around Russia and China. But in that narrative's defense, it really is the case that Russia and China together represent a more substantial threat to a general sort of liberal internationalist world order than we've seen since the end of the Cold War. I certainly think that's true.
So I want to bring up another war, a war that hasn't happened yet. But there's this novel that came out a couple of years ago called 2034. This was Elliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis. And it's about what a third world war might look like. And by the end, India is sort of the new superpower, both in terms of its capabilities and its moral authority. And, it's a good story, but it sort of left me wondering, for a country like India and Modi here this week, what is his ambition for India in the world, right? I mean, like you see the U.S. and it's the status quo power. Xi Jinping wants to make China great again. Putin wants to expand his sphere of influence again. What is India trying to do?
It's a great question. And I think, that book sounds like it was maybe written by some PR folks for Narendra Modi, because I think that is his vision, is that, he is trying to sort of make India great again. And India, of course, its taproot is an ancient civilization and the Hindu religion and, all of its history. And, the zero was discovered in India, for example. So it's at the root of great mathematics. And so I think what you're seeing from Modi is a vision of a really muscular Hindu nationalist and an influential and powerful India that can speak not just to the rich world, but also to the poor world and be a bridge between them. But, really kind of a place of majority rule. And so I think India is a country that in a lot of ways represents a future that could be. And I don't necessarily know that I think that that's necessarily a bad future. The time dominated by the United States, there has been a lot of unhappiness, war, and suffering that has unfolded in that period. So I think it's an interesting and compelling vision, and it sort of speaks to where the population is growing, the places where the economies are growing, and what overall the future is going to look like.
And this gets at something that I think is quite distinct from the Cold War era, even with this sort of Russo-Chinese alliance of authoritarianism, right? Like the great powers, or would-be great powers of today, look more like what the Portuguese writer Bruno Macias has called civilization states than they do like the USSR aspiring to make the entire world communist. Like the core of Chinese ambition is to be the sort of the dominant civilization of Asia restored to its, what it sees as sort of that ancient role. All of Vladimir Putin's ambitions are focused on this idea of like a Russian civilization that should be led by Moscow. And those are big ambitions, but it is still, the ambitions in each case are more sort of, there's a kind of invention or reinvention of tradition based around a particular civilizational legacy that is different from communism's universalism and also different from American universalism, right? That like part of the American idea, especially post-Cold War, is that our kind of liberal democracy is just going to be the globe civilization. And I don't think that, Hindutva in India and, Putin's Russian chauvinism, as dark as it can be, are after the same kind of universalizing vision.
Alrighty then, now that we've dissected the shifting global order and perception of American leadership right now, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the risks of that perception. And we're back. We've talked about America's changing place in the world. And of course, times of change can be dangerous. So just how worried are y'all?
I mean, it's obviously a dangerous moment in that the United States is currently engaged in one proxy war with a nuclear-armed power on the border of that nuclear-armed power, while at the same time trying to prepare for a potential invasion of a nebulously defined ally close to another nuclear-armed superpower, that is Taiwan and China. In that sense, yes, it's the most geopolitically dangerous moment since the end of the Cold War, without question.
And meanwhile, of course, India has rivalries that could tip into war with neighbors on two sides, right? Both the Chinese and Pakistan. And its rivalry with Pakistan has brought those two countries close to the brink of nuclear war on numerous occasions. And it's sort of terrifying to think that, there are all these different places in the world where the possibility of nuclear confrontation exists, not to mention sort of more rogue states like Iran and North Korea that really exist outside of the orbit of the, kind of broad system of international norms such as they exist. So, yeah, I would say it's a pretty terrifying time.
Now, I know a lot of people are nervous because it feels in Washington to some folks like we're rolling toward a kind of hot conflict with China, or at least a hotter one. We've got the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, overseas meeting with various Chinese officials, including President Xi. What are we hoping comes out of this, or kind of what do we see is coming out of this?
So one of the things I'm going to be writing about, I hope soon, is precisely that question. You can't open up your Amazon account or walk into a bookstore without seeing a recommendation for a book about a coming conflict with China, right? And there's hawks writing them, there's doves writing them. The best case that the doves can make is like, maybe we can avoid this for a while. The hawks who tend to write better stories because they're more exciting. You have some who say that China's on the rise, and therefore there's an inevitable clash between a rising power and an eclipsing power. But then even those who say that China's on the decline, that China is sort of basically going to seize a window of opportunity now because its economy is starting to crumble, its demographics are moving in the right direction. So they'll seize the moment soon during the 2020s to try to seize Taiwan and try to sort of, shift the global balance of power. So whatever you think about China's conditions going forward, it seems that, there's always a case to be made that there's going to be a conflict. And the arguments against them tend to be a little squishy, a little like, can't we all get along and be inclusive in the world? And, their rise doesn't mean that we have to, stop having a good life, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the only thing that people in Washington can agree on, right? That whatever it is, China's a threat, and a conflict can at most be sort of put off for a while.
Well, and I think it's interesting to just sort of see the sort of stagecraft of the Blinken trip. There's been a great deal of kind of language. And this trip was actually postponed because of the whole spy balloon fiasco. I don't know if you all remember that.
Do you enjoy a good spy balloon?
I also enjoy a good spy balloon.
Unidentified aerial. Sorry.
No, you've gotten Ross on aliens.
Different episode, Ross.
Different episode,
Ross. But then Blinken gets to China, and there was this amazing image of this kind of U-shaped table. And this kind of stagecraft in diplomacy is extremely important and I think quite revealing. And rather than having Xi sitting side by side with Tony Blinken, you have this, Xi sitting in this seat and Blinken kind of off to the side, almost like a supplicant visiting an emperor. And it's a picture that I think speaks 1,000 words in terms of how China is thinking about its place in the world and how it wants to deal with the United States. Now, of course, Blinken is the Secretary of State, not the President of the United States. Still, the imagery was unmistakable.
The Chinese love to do that stuff. They made Kissinger wait for hours when he made his famous, secret trip to reopen relations with China, for hours and hours before he could see anyone. This is something that dictators like to do. And in fact, you could see it as a bit of a sign of insecurity sometimes. They have to kind of throw their weight around in these visual ways.
Now, Carlos, I have a question that is explicitly in your wheelhouse here, which is that you've read all these books. You being you've probably read tens and thousands of pages from all of these folks who've written about China. Are you telling me that none of these books left you thinking, okay, maybe we can avoid a really ugly conflict if it goes this way?
I think, prediction is folly, right? And who knows? But there was a book that came out a few years ago by Graham Allison called Destined for War. But the subtitle was what everyone remembered. It was Can China and America Escape the Thucydides Trap? Right? And the Thucydides Trap is about the Peloponnesian Wars, and it's about how, Sparta was the status quo power and Athens was the ascendant power, and it was Sparta's fears of a rising Athens that made war inevitable. And so Graham Allison looks at a bunch of cases like that, where an ascendant power is challenging a status quo power throughout history, identifies 16 such cases. In 12 of them, they went to war. In 4, they did not. So he's not crazy about the odds.
That sounds like a great miniseries, though, right? You could just have one of those wars for every episode.
I'm just
Netflix.
glad we got to the Greeks. I mean, I feel like it only took us this many episodes.
It always
I
comes
watched you
back
smile.
to the
Lydia.
Greeks. But always.
It all comes back to
Always.
There's been this sort of bipartisan turn against the relationship that we had with China in the 1990s and 2000s, where we were sort of deeply economically integrated and assuming that that integration would contribute to liberalization in China, which it obviously has not. We've turned against that, not just because China hasn't liberalized, but because of this widespread sense that America has deindustrialized too far, that our trade policies have not worked out for American society as well as confident free traders thought in the 2000s. And this is how you have both the Trump administration and the Biden administration trying to sort of reset the trade arrangements with China, even as we are trying to sort of arm up to defend Taiwan. Those are sort of overlapping areas, but they're also sort of distinct. You could imagine a world where we say, look, it's really important for the U.S. to defend Taiwan and persuade China not to invade. But because of that, we need to have good economic relations with China. We shouldn't always be in trade wars, right? Or you could imagine saying, no, we have to have this economic reset, even at the risk of incentivizing China to go to war and try and, take over. If you're having a trade war, it's helpful to control all of the chip manufacturing infrastructure in Taiwan, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which right now you have multiple incentives in Washington or multiple theories converging on escalation with China.
I want to emphasize what Ross said about America's economic policy toward China in the 90s, when the whole argument was, look, engage, trade, open things up, and then 2 things will happen. They'll have a stake in the global economy, the Chinese will, and that economic openness will create this irresistible impulse toward political openness. But that didn't happen. The Chinese economy went gangbusters, and the system grew even more authoritarian. And what I find so interesting about that is that it shows that, one country rising, another falling. It's not just kind of the ebbs and flows of history. It's specific things that we do sometimes. The United States enabled China's economic rise. It did. It made a bet on how it would turn out. The bet ended up being wrong, right? And that was a huge part of what's happened and a huge part of why we're even having the conversation about, China seeking to supplant America as the great superpower.
Well, and I think you could also say that, America being the kind of dominant power in the world may not be a recipe for peace and maybe, sort of security for all, and may be part of the problem, that as long as any one power is trying to dominate and set the terms of the global order, there are going to be these fissures. And we should probably be humbled by the history of the last few decades and think a little bit more carefully about our place in the world. And all of these internal, external, economic, political, security factors, they're all pulling us in a direction potentially of being a little bit more focused on the home front and thinking about, how do we secure ourselves, secure our future, and how do we let other countries go forward and do the same? Our interests are not necessarily aligned. The United States and Europe have different interests in Ukraine and in the relationship with Russia, just given the dependencies. The rest of the world relies on Ukraine for food, for example. So they have a different perspective on it. And I think, maybe letting go a little and letting other powers emerge and rise and the global order sort itself out isn't necessarily such a bad thing.
It's a very Metternickian.
Why do you hate America, Lydia?
I was going to say, this is going to be a hard sell in certain circles.
I think that there are situations in which, multipolar worlds can self-stabilize. I don't think you see a ton of them in history. And American primacy hasn't been associated with major great power conflicts. Multipolar worlds tend to be more associated with that. And so that's my fear, is just that geopolitics is not a landscape where people sort of let go and let live. It is a more competitive and ruthless landscape. And, what you see in Ukraine is an example of how that works. I also want to say, since a lot of this conversation is sort of framed as a narrative of American decline, I think it's important to emphasize that the world is definitely becoming more multipolar. America's ability to sort of project our strength and sort of dominate any particular theater is diminishing. At the same time, relative to each potential rival or each potential set of allies, the U.S. still looks incredibly strong. It's not at all clear that China is going to successfully overtake us. The U.S. has become much richer relative to Europe in the last 20 years than anyone expected. And there are a lot of ways in which America is going to have many more challenges in the world, but our position as the most powerful single country in the globe seems like it could endure, again, pending nuclear Armageddon.
You can be the most powerful and still have less power than before.
Absolutely. Make America great again.
Let's leave it on that upbeat note then. And when we come back, hot cold. Right? At long last, it is time for Hot Cold, where every week one of us shares something we're into, over, or somewhere in between. So who's got this week's Hot Cold?
I'm hot colding today. So if you're among the dozens of people who follow me on social media, you'll know that it's a bit of a compulsion of mine to highlight phrases that are overused in journalism or political writing or, in the discourse. A lot of it is just lazy and cliched writing. Like, diplomats can't be experienced. They must be seasoned diplomats, right? Or FBI raids aren't just early in the morning. They're pre-dawn raids, right?
All memorials are makeshift.
All armies are ragtag. Yeah. But sometimes, though, a term isn't just lame. It's actually detrimental, I think, to a real exchange of ideas. And that's how I'm coming to feel about the term bad faith. I'm not the first person to point this out, but I am cold on bad faith. I am ice cold, Arctic cold on bad faith, right? It's not that bad faith isn't real, but it is also a real thing that people invoke, quote unquote, bad faith very often just to ignore or bypass arguments they don't like. It is a get out of argument free card, and people throw it around all the time. I just read a book where the author said, of course, I take criticisms of my views very seriously, but, the good faith criticisms. Well, congratulations, right? That's like saying I take seriously the disagreements from people who largely agree with me, but I can olympically ignore the criticisms from people whose worldviews are very different from mine, so different that they must be arguing in bad faith. Right. So this morning, I typed bad faith into the search bars of two major American newspapers. And there were references to bad faith tweets, bad faith Republicans, bad faith labor negotiations, bad faith arguments about the military or impeachment. Just take your pick. It's an all-purpose deflector shield. It also implies a kind of mind reading, right? Like, it's like, look, you're saying that, but you don't really believe it, because if you were honest, you would obviously agree with me. I would almost say that people who argue in bad faith, I would almost say that people who invoke bad faith are themselves arguing in bad faith, but then I would be actually using the term, which I refuse to do. So I could go on, but I will stop there. I would just ask you to keep an eye out for uses of bad faith and just ask yourself, how many of them are really showing bad faith? And how many of them are just ignoring inconvenient counter arguments to their views? I will stop there.
Here. I endorse everything that my esteemed colleague has said. And one thing that always baffles me about people in our profession, we are opinion mongers, right? And there are so many people in our profession whose job it is to argue, who don't want to actually argue. And I'm always mystified by that. To me, if you think someone's arguing in bad faith, why wouldn't you just rebut their argument? If they're arguing in bad faith, they've lost an argument and you're up one.
Well, Ross, some of us, we're lovers, not fighters.
No, that's fair. That's fair. And I might like an argument a little too much. So, so I've been told.
All right.
See you next week.
Sincerely, I can't wait to talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for joining our conversation. If you liked it, be sure to follow Matter of Opinion on your favorite podcast app. And let us know what big question we should think about next by emailing us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com. Matter of Opinion was produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Derek Arthur. Edited by Stephanie Joyce. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Efim Shapiro, Carol Sabaro, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.